Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In this episode, we're going to find out what happened with Bertie and Elizabeth after the war. Well, when the war was over, David, Bertie's brother, decided to visit Bertie. They had a long talk over tea at Buckingham Palace. Wallace came to London with David, but they wisely kept her away from the palace. Elizabeth told Lilibet that David had a yelling fit and told Bertie that because he couldn't or wouldn't do what he asked, that Bertie must hate him. Elizabeth thought that was unfair because, as she said, Papa is so scrupulously fair and thoughtful and honest about all that had happened. And once David had abdicated, Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to see David, and she would only see Wallace 3 more times after Bertie's death. Queen Mary said the barrier was simply too high. Bertie was feeling burnt out by September of 1945, and according to the book George VI and Elizabeth, Bertie had written to his brother Henry that he had been suffering from an awful reaction from the strain of war. Time magazine said that he had aged, his sandy-colored hair was getting gray, and he had lines in his face. Well, I imagine being in charge during the war would do that to you. And one day, at the end of the October, Winston Churchill turned up at the palace feeling great because he took a break in Italy. The king told his secretary that he never had time for recuperation. He had the boxes, official papers, and audiences, even when he was on vacation. On Christmas that same year, George VI and Elizabeth went to Sandringham's big house for the first time since 1939. Queen Mary's lady-in-waiting came back from a 6-year absence, and she was in awe of the informality. The entrance hall had a table covered with jigsaw puzzles that the princesses and their friends worked on day and night. The radio was operated by Princess Elizabeth. She was playing loud tunes on her radio, so it's neat to hear about the young teenager Elizabeth having fun with her family. The aide also noticed that the king looked tired and strained, and he didn't eat very much. The aide complimented the king on his Christmas speech, and he looked to where the queen was and said, "She helps me," and he looked at her with pride. The lady-in-waiting also observed Princess Elizabeth, and she said, "She seemed to me one of the most unselfish girls I had ever met, always the first to give way in any of the small issues that arise in every home." And she felt that Princess Elizabeth was quiet and simple, and that Margaret was in high spirits. Mabel, the lady-in-waiting, also felt like the king was devoted to both daughters. Mabel felt that he spoiled the 15-year-old Margaret and treated her like a child. Lilibet was his constant companion in shooting, walking, riding, and everything. She said that his affection for her was touching. So now Prince Philip makes appearances. The king and queen realized Elizabeth and Philip were in love with each other. They spent time with him and knew him to be royal. He was descended from Queen Victoria on his mother's side, and the Greek royal family, which was really Danish and German, with no Greek blood. Philip had a Royal Navy salary, and he was penniless. Queen Mary thought that Philip was suitable for marriage to Princess Elizabeth. The king agreed with Mary and thought he was smart, and he had a sense of humor, and he thought things in the right way. And the king and queen felt that Lilibet was too young at the age of 18 to be married, and needed to meet more young men of her own age, and Queen Mary agreed. Queen Mary thought he was extremely nice. In 1946, Queen Mary told her lady-in-waiting that Elizabeth and Philip had been in love for the last 18 months or maybe longer. The king and queen, of course, felt that at 19, Lilibet was too young to get engaged. And Queen Mary said that Bertie and Elizabeth wanted her to see more of the world before committing herself. Queen Mary felt that Elizabeth would always know her own mind. She was like her father, Mary said. She won't give her heart lightly, but when she does, it'll be for always. Aristocratic guards were invited to the palace, but Elizabeth wasn't interested. She had a picture of Philip that she kept on her mantelpiece. The king and queen realized that they couldn't change Elizabeth's mind about Philip, and invited Philip to Balmoral for a 2-week stay. It was on one of those days that Philip proposed to Elizabeth, and she said yes, and they both went to the king and queen to tell them. Agreed with their engagement, but he asked that Philip and Elizabeth postpone their wedding until the royal family returned from a tour of Africa that was to take place the following year, and by then Elizabeth would be 21. So Dickie Mountbatten worked with Philip on his application for British citizenship, so he had to renounce his Greek royal title, which was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. He was serving in the Royal Navy, so he was allowed to be naturalized with the approval of George VI and the Prime Minister. The king had granted him to have the title HRH, Prince Philip, but Philip declined to be a British prince. He wanted to be a simple subject and took the surname Mountbatten. It was an Anglicized version of his mother's name, Battenberg. So now the trip to Africa. And when the family took the trip to South Africa, they were on a boat when they learned that England was having freezing temperatures and blizzards and then floods. And there was a coal shortage and the government needed to ration gas and electricity. The king got upset about this and he offered to fly back to Britain. But he was told not to because it would only make people think that things were worse. It didn't stop the king from worrying, though. The king and queen knew that South Africa was complex. When they arrived in South Africa, it was 105 degrees, and that was February the 17th, 1947. The crowds were large and enthusiastic. So they went on to a state banquet, and there was plenty of food there, grapes, peaches, pears, and beautiful flowers. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Mary about the severe racial problems there, and they opened the parliament on their 5th day in Cape Town. That afternoon they got on the white train. It was 14 coaches long, and they would tour for 10 weeks. The train became their home, and it was air-conditioned, thank goodness. So the train would stop a lot so the family could greet the crowds at the small stations and road crossings. And when it happened, late in the evening, the queen and the girls, they wore their jewelry over their nightgowns to look like they were wearing evening dresses. Sometimes they stayed at government residences and hotels, and then they would ride horses at dawn, have tennis matches, swim, and picnic. They saw cities, countryside, historic battlefields, and the great animals of Africa: steenboks, wildebeest, giraffes, zebras, hippos, and they were at the game reserve. They went to garden parties. They cut ostrich feathers at an ostrich farm. Zulu warriors did their tribal dances with sticks and shields, and they only dressed in leopard skins. The king and queen felt a little nervous when they went to the part of the country called Orange Free State, which was heavily Afrikaner. They were greeted kindly by them, which was a relief. The last day of the trip, Princess Elizabeth gave her first coming-of-age address on live radio, and it was broadcasted to 200 million people around the world. Wow, that's a lot of people. So she was confident sounding and emotional. She said she felt at home in South Africa despite being born, as she said, 6,000 miles from there. She called for the listeners to go forward with high courage and a quiet heart to make the Commonwealth more free, more prosperous, more happy, and an influence for good in the world. The end of her speech was perfection. She said, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to our service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." So Queen Mary heard the speech at Marlborough House in London, and she thought it was perfect. She said she wept, and Bertie and Elizabeth did, and so did Winston Churchill. The trip tired everybody out. Queen Elizabeth said she was so tired that she felt quite sucked dry sometimes, and it was even worse for the king. He became cranky at one point during the trip and began to fuss at a chauffeur. The king's equerry shouted, "For heaven's sake, shut up, or there's going to be an accident." Later, the king apologized and said he was very tired. The tour was a triumph for the royal family. Princess Elizabeth showed she was a natural. She enjoyed herself without shyness, and she would see for the first time the cultural and racial divisions that she'd never encountered before. It helped her when she became a queen. It gave her the ability to maintain the integrity of the Commonwealth during testing times. Once they returned home, the king had a chill, and he stayed in bed for 3 days. And the king should have gained weight in Africa with all the food that they were given, but he lost 17 pounds in 4 months. The country was glad to have the royal family back home again, and when they were in the carriage, they got a rousing welcome, and they were cheered when they went out on the balcony. So I'm going to stop the video here, and next time we're going to learn even more about how Philip got along with his future in-laws, and how Elizabeth and Bertie handled their duties, and how they all did together as a family. It's been wonderful to learn about this time in the history of the years that Elizabeth's father and mother were in charge, and how they rose to the occasion, never thinking that they were going to be on the throne. They say things turn out the way they're supposed to, and that scene is correct in this instance. And I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really be appreciated. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.